Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion number 7974 in the name of Fergus Ewing on carbon capture and storage. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to move the motion. Minister, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome today's opportunity to debate for the very first time in the Scottish Parliament carbon capture and storage, and to discuss the part that CCS can play as part of Scotland's future energy mix and the economic opportunities that could be realised through the development of a vibrant CCS industry in Scotland. I'd like to start out by pointing out that the Scottish Government has expressed wholehearted support for CCS, and we have done so consistently over a long period. And we recognise the important role that could be played by CCS in reducing CO2 emissions, as well as in driving economic growth and jobs. We were supportive, Presiding Officer, of the original CCS project at Peterhead, BP's DF1 project, and the subsequent commercial scale project at Longcarrot. We were disappointed that neither of these projects came to fruition, but we don't dwell on the past. We must look to the future. CCS technology could transform the way we generate power, help reduce carbon emissions, and support the security of our electricity supply. Here in Scotland and worldwide, it is a fact that hydrocarbons will remain a central element of the energy mix for many years to come. Currently, more than 80%, Presiding Officer, of global primary energy use is fossil fuel-based. However, while we move towards an increasing share of renewables, we have a duty to minimise carbon emissions whilst also ensuring sustainable economic growth. CCS is the only technology available to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from large-scale fossil fuel usage in the industrial and power sectors, and it is entirely complementary to renewables where clean thermal baseload will still be required to balance the intermittency of wind power. CCS is part of the lowest cost route to decarbonisation. Indeed, when we talk about CCS, the cost of not doing it is a sobering reality. The International Energy Agency has estimated that by 2050, the cost of tackling climate change without CCS could be 40% higher than with CCS. Now, this morning, Presiding Officer, many MSPs and researchers of MSPs attended an excellent briefing, a briefing supplied from two companies, Shell and the Summit Power Group. And I am indebted to the representatives from both companies that came, some of whom are here in the chamber, to listen to the debate this afternoon. We heard from Rick Redmond, the CEO of the Summit Power Group, about the exciting opportunities that could arise from the development of the Captain Clean Energy project. And I'm grateful to Rick for travelling from Seattle to do this for us today. And he told us about the potential impact the Captain Clean Energy project could have, that it could deliver up to £3.4 billion of gross value added to the Scottish economy, as well as delivering, I believe, of the order of 2,000 jobs in the construction phase and many operational jobs, 300 operational jobs, as the project is implemented. We also heard from Belinda Perriman of Shell, who spoke about the Peterhead CCS project. It's clear that whilst this project will have short-term economic benefits, it also represents a unique opportunity for Scotland to lead the way globally in this emerging industry. Peterhead CCS will be the first project in the world to demonstrate clean electricity from gas, thereby positioning Scotland to develop key competencies and supply chain capabilities. But economic impact and supply chain opportunities are only part of the picture, and both projects could create a step change in emissions reductions in Scotland. Peterhead will produce 400 megawatts of clean electricity from gas, and Captain Clean Energy proposed to produce 570 megawatts of clean electricity from coal. Captain proposed to capture and store 3.8 million tonnes of CO2 per annum, and Peterhead Power up to 1 million tonnes of CO2 per year. Therefore, between these two projects, Presiding Officer, we see clean electricity, new jobs and reduced emissions, an impressive triumvirate. What these projects tell us is that global companies like Shell and Summit Power are willing to invest in Scotland to develop commercial-scale CCS for a range of very positive reasons, and let me outline some of these. First of all, Scotland has many of the skills and engineering experience gained from the oil and gas industries which are transferable to CCS. We have companies like Doosan Babcock actively researching CCS technologies, and we have substantial academic expertise in many of our universities. It's hard to single out any, and I mean no disrespect to those who I can't name this afternoon, but I would wish to make special mention of Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage, a collaboration between Heriot-Watt, University of Edinburgh and the British Geological Society, and few other UK bodies have done so much to promote, research and advocate CCS. And I would pay a special tribute to Professor Stuart Hazeldine in this respect. Previous research has clearly highlighted Scotland's massive CO2 storage capacity. We have easily sufficient capacity to store our industrial carbon emissions for the next 200 years and to receive and store as much as 100 million tonnes of CO2 a year by 2030. And indeed, the importance of the North Sea in terms of European CO2 storage is also recognised, notably by the Zero Emissions Platform and the North Sea Basin Task Force. They understand the importance of the central North Sea as a CO2 storage hub. Secondly, in relation to the CCS regulatory framework, Presiding Officer, Scotland, in conjunction with the UK Government, was one of the first parts of the EU to legislate for CCS, implementing the EU CCS directive by the end of 2011. We then proactively developed a regulatory roadmap to allow the permitting and consenting of large-scale CCS projects. Our regulatory roadmap has since been shared with governments all over the world and used by the UK Government, the European Commission, the International Energy Agency and the Global CCS Institute to promote regulatory best practice. And indeed, that was one of the reasons why the Global CCS Institute came to Scotland to celebrate and to have their conference in May this year. I had the pleasure of inviting their CEO, Brad Page, who recognised the fact that Scotland has achieved a great deal in promoting, supporting and advocating CCS, ideals at the very heart of that global institution. And I thought that that was a fairly positive endorsement of our efforts to date. Presiding Officer, I believe that Scotland is a natural place to develop a CCS industry, and the building blocks of this new industry could be the two CCS projects currently proposed in Scotland. The Peterhead Power project was announced as a preferred bidder in the UK CCS competition in March, which was very good news for Scotland and places us in a very good position going forward. However, it is equally important that we do not lose highly innovative CCS projects like the Captain Clean Energy project for a number of reasons. The two projects selected for preferred bidder status in DEC's competition, one coal and one gas, is good news, and we support that. I welcome that support from DEC and obviously wish to make it clear to the UK government parties that we are working very closely in partnership with the UK government in respect of all of these matters. But it is clear to me, going ahead, that we will need more than two projects if we are to see the benefits for Scotland and the UK. Indeed, multiple CCS projects will provide the kind of learning that will be required to rapidly reduce the cost of CCS, to make it commercially appealing and able to compete with other low-carbon technologies. As I mentioned earlier, there are massive economic benefits that can be accrued from the development of a CCS project, and the Scottish Government has already recognised the importance of delivering CCS in relation to power generation in our national planning framework on which we're consulting, which sets the agenda for long-term spatial planning in Scotland. So we do not wish to lose this once-in-a-generation opportunity, Presiding Officer, to future-proof clean thermal baseload capacity, to increase our security of supply, and to reduce harmful emissions into the bargain. So I want to work with, and continue to work with, the UK Government Ministers to ensure that projects which do not enjoy preferred bidder status are incentivised through the electricity market reform process. And I think, Presiding Officer, if I could touch on the Conservative amendment, that the sentiments of the Conservative amendment are very much in keeping with our own thoughts on this matter. The differences are minor, but we do believe that the Summit Power project should perhaps be specifically supported as well as the Shell project going forward. But these matters are taken forward in a reasonable way with the UK Government, and I wanted to make that clear for Mr Fraser's benefit and that of Mr MacArthur too. And we do want to see the next contract for difference process move forward as swiftly as possible to ensure that projects outside the competition have every chance of succeeding. We also note that there are opportunities as well for enhanced oil recovery, and this is something which is being pursued in many other parts of the planet as well. I remain absolutely convinced not only that CCS is technically viable, the various components of the technology have been tried and tested throughout the world. Putting them all together is something that hasn't been attempted in Europe, but the various components of the technology, in response, I think, to Mr Harvey's amendment, have been tried and tested according to the experts that I've had, and I'm happy to take intervention from Mr Harvey in this respect.
Patrick Harvey.
So forgive knowledge that one of the things we don't yet understand is what the overall energy balance and the overall carbon balance will be in terms of either the energy used to capture, transport and store the carbon, or indeed the carbon which is released if he pursues enhanced oil recovery.
Minister.
Well, I'm not an expert in these matters, but my understanding from those who are expert in these matters is that the application of the CCS technology is one where we have a high degree of confidence that there will be a very, very substantial reduction in carbon emissions. And I think that the technology has been tried and tested in various parts of the world. Indeed, I may expand on that if I have the opportunity when closing. But we want to work with people in all parties in order to deliver what seems to me to be a method of delivering green electricity from fossil fuels, both gas and coal. And I hope that we can all unite around that. Presiding Officer, I have great pleasure in opening this debate today. I think it will be a constructive debate. I've been pleased that representatives from all parties have attended the briefing session and indeed an informal occasion yesterday evening to hear more about the opportunities for Scotland from both of these very exciting projects and from the further application of CCS possibly throughout the world.
Thank you. I now call on Murdo Fraser to speak to Move Amendment number 7974.2. Mr Fraser, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by welcoming the fact we're having this debate, and can I welcome the opening comments from the Minister and the manner in which he put them. I'll come in a moment to address more specifically the wording of the motion and our amendment and the concern we had. But I think it's fair to say at the outset there's actually very little difference between us, which the Minister fairly accepted. We just had a concern with one or two minor aspects of what was in his motion. The Minister was quite right to highlight the importance of this issue. We have a huge resource in terms of fossil fuels, both within Scotland and within the UK more widely. We have fossil fuel burning stations, not least Longannet, within my own parliamentary region, which provides a very high percentage, sometimes up as high as 40% of Scotland's electricity needs burning coal. We have other gas burning stations. We have hundreds of years' worth of reserves of coal in the ground. Indeed, the issue with coal at the moment, as we've debated previously, is that the world price of coal is so low, it's becoming almost uneconomic to mine it within our own country. We also have continued supplies of North Sea gas, and of course you have the opportunity that is shale gas, which, as we've heard many times before, has been exploited in the US. But of course the issue with these sources of fuel is burning them and releasing carbon into the atmosphere is incompatible with the climate change targets that we have set. So we have to try and tackle this issue. Now, of course, we could just move wholesale to low carbon sources of energy, such as renewables and nuclear. But these come at a cost. And we've debated again many times in this chamber the fact that the higher costs of renewables and nuclear relative to burning fossil fuels makes them beyond our reach to provide 100% of our needs at the present time, if we're also be aware of the question of affordability and the cost of living, which is something we are always debating in this chamber. So if we can find a way, economically and affordably, of burning fossil fuels whilst treating the carbon, then we have an ideal solution, and we can continue to do both. And I was interested in, and I'm pleased to hear the Minister accept this point, that if we're going to develop more renewables, and that particularly means at the moment more wind, both on and offshore, we need to balance the intermittency. Having more gas burning stations is the simplest way of doing that, but we have to capture the carbon coming from that gas. So CCS is absolutely vital in terms of developing an energy industry at an affordable cost and meeting our climate change obligations. It also has the opportunity, of course, to increase the rate of exploitation from North Sea oil reserves by pumping the carbon under the sea. Now, it's good news, and I was pleased to hear the Minister accept this, that the UK Government has supported the projects, both at Peterhead and White Rose in Yorkshire, and the UK has the potential to be a world leader in this technology. The CCS roadmap, which has been published by the Department for Energy and Climate Change, has a number of proposals. There's a CCS commercialisation programme with £1 billion worth of capital funding to support commercial scale CCS, and we know the 2 bidders have been successful in going to the next stage of that. There's a £125 million 4-year coordinated R&D and innovation programme, which is covering fundamental research and understanding, and the establishment of a new UK CCS research centre. And there are universities throughout the UK, including in Scotland, which are benefiting from that investment. The development of a market for low-carbon electricity through electricity market reform, and that relates to the feed-in tariffs for contracts for difference. Intervention to address key barriers to the deployment of CCS, including work to support the CCS supply chain, develop transport and storage networks, prepare for the deployment of CCS on industrial applications, and ensure the right regulatory framework is in place. And international engagement, so we are sharing the knowledge that we are generating with other countries in the world and learning from them at the same time, and that will help accelerate cost reduction. So a lot of work is going on within the UK Government and within DEC. It's good that work is being supported by the Scottish Government, and Scotland will see many opportunities from that, not least at Peterhead, but further afield. To return to the Minister's motion, as I said previously, there's a lot on this we agreed with. I was just a little bit concerned about this being so specific in relation to the competition needing to have more than 2 bidders. I was also a little bit concerned that there was a mention of a specific project of the Captain Clean Energy project. That's not to say I in any way disagree with that project. I had the benefit of meeting promoters of that project some months ago. I was not able to get to the briefing this morning due to other engagements, but I have met them before, and that is a great opportunity, and I certainly would like to see that progress. And indeed, there will be the opportunity to do that as the commercialisation programme proceeds, if more money does become available or is freed up from the current process. But I think at this stage, to be too specific about that, I was concerned about, so I lodged the amendment which is in my name. And I did also want to draw specific attention to the opportunity for Scottish universities from the innovation funding that I referred to a moment ago. So our amendment is intended to be a gentle push in the right direction for the Scottish Government, rather than a fundamental disagreement with the direction that they are taking. I read with great interest Patrick Harvey's amendment. I must say a lot of that I agreed with too. I thought it made a lot of sense. I wasn't quite sure about the point saying that we would undermine our climate change arguments if we promoted CCS. I think that's the whole point of carbon capture and storage, is that you can continue to utilise fossil fuels whilst removing the dangerous element, which is the carbon. It doesn't seem to me contradictory, but maybe in a moment Patrick will explain. Thank you, Patrick.
Patrick Harvey.
Hopefully it was clear from the amendment that we're not suggesting that CCS as a technology undermines the climate change objectives. But if we use it simply to extract more fossil fuels than we would have done otherwise, which are burned primarily in transport modes where future CCS is not possible, or indeed if we use it as a pretext for increasing fossil fuel generating capacity before CCS is available, those things will undermine the climate change objectives.
Okay, I'm grateful for that clarity, and of course we should all be aware of pretexts, and I'm grateful for to Patrick for making that clear. I just want to touch on the issue of Longannet, because the Minister mentioned it, and I'm sure it will come up in the debate. I just wanted to get my retaliation in first in relation to the Longannet situation. I'm disappointed, as many members are, Longannet CCS project did not proceed. It's within my own parliamentary region. The background to this, of course, was that the consortium behind it, of Scottish Power and National Grid, Carbon and Shell, told DEC in October 2011 of a number of difficulties with that project. The costs were increasing. They were up to 1.5 billion, or even perhaps as high as 1.9 billion, above the £1 billion limit. That was being attributed by DEC. There were technical issues in addition, such as the length of the underwater pipeline. Of course, an issue avoided by having the new trial project in Peterhead, and the cost of upgrading to comply with the EU directive on large combustion plants. And I think whilst it was unfortunate that project could not proceed, it's entirely understandable why DEC said it didn't make sense to invest yet more money in that particular scheme. The Auditor General's report on this in March 2012 laid the door firmly at the door of the previous UK government, concluding that, and I quote, the competition was launched in 2007 with insufficient planning and recognition of the commercial risks. So I think it's unfortunate that the previous government went about it in that particular way. And I hope that having the new plant at Peterhead, Scotland will see the opportunity from this that was at risk of being lost when Longannet came towards an end. There was one further point I want to touch on, Presiding Officer, in relation to the provenness of the technology. It's mentioned in Patrick Harvey's amendment. It's also mentioned in the RSP briefing for this debate, and it's come up at the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. The Minister is quite right to say the technology works. What we don't know is, does it work at economic cost to allow us to continue to burn fossil fuels on a financially stable basis? When Scottish Power and SSE previously gave evidence to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee back in February this year, they were certainly questioning that. And this is important because if the Scottish Government is to meet its obligations in terms of climate claims legislation, and specifically on RPP2, it needs to make sure that carbon capture and storage does work. It's an absolutely essential component. And as I and other members raised at the committee and is raised in the RSPB briefing, there is no plan B. There's no alternative. So we are keeping our fingers crossed, hoping that CCS will actually work, that it will be affordable, that it will present a strong economic case. I hope it does, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm sure the Scottish Government agree with me, but at the moment there is no guarantee of that, which is why we're having the experimental programmes being taken forward at Peterhead and at Yorkshire. And if it doesn't work, then the Scottish Government does have a very serious problem. Let me just say in closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, I very much welcome the debate. I welcome the way the Minister has introduced it. I welcome the partnership that is happening between Scottish and UK governments on this particular issue. Scotland has an opportunity of being a world leader in developing this vital new technology. That is something we should all embrace, and I have pleasure in moving the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Patrick Harvey to speak to and move Amendment 7974.1. Mr Harvey, you have 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Fergus Ewing, in opening this debate, said that it's the first debate that we've had on CCS. It may be the first debate with that phrase in the subject title, but the topic has been discussed in many other debates as well as in sessions of committees on many occasions. I welcome the fact that we're having a debate specifically on this topic, but during those previous exchanges, Greens have sought to highlight some concerns. Concerns, not objections, to the development of CCS technology. And there have been times when we have been, perhaps unintentionally, misrepresented as being opposed to the development of this technology. And I'd like to say again at the outset that we welcome the research which is being conducted, and we are interested to find out whether, as Murdo Fraser says, not only this technology is technically viable, but whether it can be sufficiently cost-effective, whether it can achieve the right energy balance and carbon balance as well, whether in fact it has the potential that very many people claim that it already has. And there have been times when Mr Ewing and others have talked about CCS as though it's already here. They've talked about the incredibly important role it can play, not the incredibly important role it might play. I'd like to give one more example, something which landed on my desk today. This is the report, I'm sure other members have been sent the same thing, from SSE and Shell about the Peterhead project. Up here, pointing to the sky, up here, too much CO2 is a problem. Deep down under the North Sea, we have a solution. No, you don't. Deep down under the North Sea, we're working on a solution. Maybe. That would be a more honest representation of the facts. The solution is not there yet. It may be there, and if it is, I will welcome it as a transitional technology as we move away from fossil fuel consumption. It would allow us to ease that transition somewhat. Not as an alternative, not to suggest that we can carry on using fossil fuels forever, because even if CCS technology is technically viable, commercially viable, and achieves the right carbon balance, it's still not going to last forever. You're still talking about using finite space to store a finite commodity. It will last for a certain amount of time, and it'll allow us, if it works, to ease that transition. But it's not there yet. We don't have it yet, and we mustn't rely on it. And so one of the dangers that Greens have sought to highlight is the danger that it is used politically as a pretext to justify increased fossil fuel energy generating capacity now, before we have CCS available to deploy. And we debated that in the last session of Parliament in relation to the proposed Hunterston coal-fired power station. And secondly, that CCS is used in relation to enhanced oil recovery. Now, if, as the Minister has told me, I should welcome huge amounts of oil to be extracted, which will be hugely beneficial. He's suggested in previous debates that Greens ought to welcome that. If oil is going to be extracted from a reserve, then it will make sense to put carbon back in there. But if that's oil that wouldn't otherwise have been extracted, then what we've done is take fossil fuels from one location in the earth, burn them to produce energy, and taken the carbon into another location in the earth, and taken more fossil fuel from that location for use in energy sources which can't have CCS apply to them. So that carbon, that fossil carbon, ends up in the atmosphere at the end of the day. And it's unlikely in the current political context that that's an alternative to exploiting new reserves, because the Scottish Government supports the everlasting pursuit of new additional reserves of fossil fuels for extraction. I did miss, I'm sorry to say, the briefing which the Government kindly offered. I had the task of moving some amendments to the referendum bill, and I'm sure the Minister wouldn't have wanted me to miss that important duty. But I did take the opportunity to meet with Mr Redman, and indeed with Professor Hazeldine, before the debate. And I got the impression that both of them understand these concerns. The concern that enhanced oil recovery will lead to a carbon balance which does undermine our objectives to reduce emissions, and the danger that CCS, or the potential for CCS, can be used as a pretext in the short term to justify increased fossil fuel extraction and use. Fergus Ewing told us in his opening speech that this technology offers us clean electricity, new jobs, and reduced emissions. Maybe, only if these dangers that I'm seeking to highlight are understood, acknowledged, and avoided. It's also important that we note the IPCC report on climate change just recently, and the increasingly unavoidable body of evidence that the world has far more fossil fuels in existing reserves than we can afford to burn. Mr Wheelhouse, the Climate Change Minister, seemed to acknowledge this very recently, and he's been quoted as saying, "I've put it on record and I accept that we can't burn all the fossil fuels that there are, and that applies to Scotland as with every nation." I'd be interested to know whether Mr Ewing has sat down and discussed the question of how much unburnable carbon Scotland has, because every time he talks about assessments of the value of 3 billion barrels of oil that this CCS technology can unlock, he talks about it only as a positive economic resource. Now, oil, fossil fuel, can be an economic resource if we use them within the limits of the environment that sustains us. If we use those resources beyond that limit, It is an economic liability and a threat to the very existence of our civilization. Yeah.
Minister.
Patrick Harvey mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which did clearly state, as I understand in its 2013 report, that climate change limitation will require substantial and sustained reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. That was in the report. The point I made earlier was that the International Energy Agency have calculated that global carbon cleanup of energy is faster and 40% cheaper if CCS is used. Does Mr Harvey feel that that's a strong argument in favour of learning about and adopting CCS technology?
Patrick Harvey.
If CCS achieves the test that I've set out, if it's used in the right way, it may well offer that kind of saving. But if used in the wrong way, if used as a political pretext for extracting ever more fossil fuels, if used as a political pretext for expanding fossil fuel generating capacity before CCS is available at a practical level to deploy, then it will do the opposite. In closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, I do echo the comments in RSPB's paper as well. If we don't have this technology available to deploy in the short term, what is the plan B? And if we do have this technology available to deploy, then we can talk about the choices it opens up once that deployment is possible. Before then, those choices are not before us. And I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Ian Gray, 6 minutes or thereby.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I also welcome this opportunity to debate the potential for carbon capture technology here in Scotland. And I'm certainly surprised if it is the first time that it's been debated in the Chamber. Last week, in and out of the Chamber, we spent some time exploring our differences with the Scottish Government over aspects of energy policy. But this debate, I think, as other speakers have said, does take place within one of those crucial areas where we find ourselves largely in agreement with the Government and indeed with other parties represented here in the Chamber, agreeing on the potential of carbon capture and storage technology, agreeing about the urgency of progressing that potential, and agreeing about the opportunity that it provides. And I think it is worth, as Patrick Harvey just did, going back to first principles and reminding ourselves that the greatest driver for this is, of course, the imperative of addressing the global issue of climate change. And as he pointed out, recent weeks have seen the IPCC's latest and their strongest, I think, ever assertion that global warming is firstly real and that it is very likely that more than half of recent temperature rises are directly caused by human activity. And earlier this week, delegates to the Climate Justice Conference here in Scotland heard very powerful and direct testimony of the impact this is already having on the world's poorest and most vulnerable citizens, who are, of course, the least culpable in creating this problem. So we are right, indeed we are obliged to pursue dramatic reductions in carbon emissions. But the populations we represent also oblige us to ensure that we continue to provide electricity production for the economy and for personal use. And so to square that circle, we simply have to find ways to generate electricity without the release of millions of tonnes of carbon into the biosphere. We believe the Scottish Government is right to commit itself to the decarbonisation of the power industry by 2030. Indeed, we believe the whole of the UK should make that commitment to, as Labour has said it will, should it win the next general election. This is something which the industry needs clarity on, so they are clear what is required of them. But if I could digress briefly into an area of disagreement and constituency interest, it does seem to me perverse that we should discount from this objective the expansion of non-carbon emitting consistent baseload produced by nuclear power, especially as any chance we have at all of reaching that decarbonisation target is really based on extending the life of Scotland's two existing nuclear stations, one of which, Torness, in my own constituency is not only continuing to provide a significant proportion of our electricity, but recently passed the landmark of 200 terawatt-hours produced since 1988, avoiding 130 million tonnes of carbon, the equivalent of removing all cars from the whole of the UK for 2 years.
Fergus Ewing.
I thank Ian Gray for giving way. I just wonder if he would acknowledge that the position that the Scottish Government has very clearly and consistently stated is that we welcome the extension of the life of the existing nuclear power stations. Indeed, I attended the ceremony at Hunterston to recognise the extension of the life of that station, and the same it was expected to apply in Torness, provided it's safe to do so, and therefore we do, in fact, support the position that Mr Gray has adopted with regard to the existing stations.
Up to a point, as it were, because we do restrict ourselves if we veto expanding that into new nuclear generation. But I accept that that is the government's position, and that throws an even greater urgency on the development of CCS. So that is also the case, of course, because of the government target of producing the equivalent of 100% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2020. Because, as the Minister himself acknowledged, that will have to be backed up by around 2.5 gigawatts of conventional thermal generation. So we do agree with the Scottish Government that we need to move forward on the demonstration of CCS at a commercial scale. And we do agree with them too that this does mean significant support being made available from the UK Government, in particular for the Peterhead proposal, which would allow the demonstration of how the technology could work with Scotland's particular geography and our history of North Sea oil production. I think it is regrettable that such support has been reduced to £1 billion from the £2 billion originally planned by the previous government, and I do have concerns about consistent uncertainty about the availability of the cash during the CSR period. We need to see this cash with certainty, and we need to see tangible momentum. I think too that the Captain Clean Energy project holds out enormous potential, albeit, and perhaps importantly, a different technology, new build rather than retrofit. And I understand that this is not dependent on government capital investment, which I think is always helpful, but I do also understand that it needs a decision on the contract for difference price. And once again, we are happy to echo and support the Minister's representations to the UK Government that this be expedited. Presiding Officer, we have some concerns about the Government's motion, but I think they are concerns of clarity rather than substance. We wouldn't wish to see the UK Government's support spread any more thinly amongst projects, but our assumption is the motion is actually calling for greater investment by government overall, something we're happy to agree with. And similarly, the reference to the Captain project we felt is a little ambiguous in that it suggests that capital investment is being sought, whereas my understanding is that's not the case. But I think the Minister did make clear that by incentivisation, in this case, he means through the contract for difference system. So, we may have some differences with or criticisms of the Scottish Government's approach to cutting carbon emissions, and no doubt some of those will be explored in the course of the afternoon. But there is no doubt that we agree with the principal proposition today that carbon capture is a technology we must pursue if we are ever to meet our obligations to address climate change. And on that basis, we will happily support the Government motion this evening.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate. There is a little time in hand. Modest amounts of interventions would be welcomed. And I now call on Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And of course, as the constituency member for the area within which Peterhead Power Station is based, I have a particular and long-term interest in this project. It was disappointing that previous attempts to move ahead with carbon capture at Peterhead have as yet come to naught, but we look forward with optimism to where we're now going. A number of people, including the Minister, referred to Professor Stuart Hazeldine, and it's worth just quoting what he says. He says the Peterhead carbon capture and storage project is a visionary opportunity for Scotland and the UK. It is the first step towards opening up the North Sea as a global hub for the carbon storage industry and will bring investment and long-term growth to the region. And I cannot disagree with a single word that is said in that context. We shouldn't imagine, of course, that there are no carbon capture and storage projects around the world. There is one in Inner Mongolia, a number of others in China, some in Canada, some in the United States. There is a lignite-based one in Poland. But what there is not, and what makes Peterhead distinctively unique, is that there are as yet no gas-based carbon capture and storage opportunities yet operating. So for Peterhead, there is that key opportunity. And in the context, whatever we may feel about it, of an increased focus on gas extraction by unconventional means in many other countries, possibly in Scotland, but probably not, there will be a bigger market for the technologies related to carbon capture and storage from gas plants. Now, we have particular advantages in Scotland and at Peterhead. In particular at Peterhead, you're within spitting distance, near enough, within about 4 or 5 kilometres of the St Fergus terminal, which is where the carbon dioxide from Peterhead would be transported, liquefied, purified and pumped out over existing pipelines to now unused oil fields in the North Sea. So we've got the infrastructure in place. And it is worth, of course, also saying that with a pipeline from St Fergus all the way down to Mossmorton and Fife, the connection between Longannet and that pipeline or the route there is not a huge technical challenge. But it is of a different character, and I will say not a great deal about that. Now, pumping the CO2 into subsea reservoirs addresses a number of issues. First of all, gives us a new way of exploiting an asset we have. Yes, it does enable us to get more oil out of the oil fields. And indeed, there has been in North America an existing carbon capture and storage system which is deliberately designed to repressurise a field and extract more oil. So we know that works. But of course, oil is not simply something to put in our cars and our buses for transport. It will, in the long term, be of continuing importance as a feedstock for our chemical industries, long after we've found the technologies to move totally away from it in the transport network. So getting more oil out of our fields is important. And the £1 billion of government money £1 billion of government money that we're looking at being required to start this industry on its road to success is much less than the tax take there will be from repressurising oil fields and getting more oil out. The tax on that, you'll get your money back. Now, of course, you have to pay now and you get the benefit later. And there are challenges in that. There are, in China, 6 carbon capture projects already working. Interestingly, in a range of areas, thermal, coal chemical, cement and the steel sectors are all either running or being planned, but no gas. So the opportunity is there for us. We also, of course, in the North Sea, we have a network of pipes throughout the North Sea, which means we'll be able to take carbon dioxide, carbonic acid, from a range of countries. I know, for example, public opinion in Poland is not very keen on the idea of storing the CO2 under where people stay. Now, I happen to think the evidence for that's not particularly material, but we can solve that problem for the Poles by taking the carbon dioxide away and storing it under the sea. We have unique advantages in that we have a well-understood geology, and we know where all the holes that have been drilled into the geology are, because we've good record keeping from the exploitation of these oil fields. We've got a good network of pipes. They're the biggest risk to releasing CO2, but we understand the pipes. We understand the valve technology with lots of companies that have been working in this industry. CO2, by the way, in China, from carbon capture is even being used in the food industry, in baking and in the making of fizzy drinks. But one of the most exciting things that may come and that plays into Scotland's strength in the biosector is that in Australia there are algosynthesis facilities being used where CO2 from carbon capture is being used to feed algae to produce fuel. So there are a whole series of opportunities. This is just the first steps on a huge opportunity that will extend to many different areas. Presiding Officer, bio, jobs, lots of jobs in my constituency and across Scotland. Yes, there is more oil than we can afford to burn, but we need it for other purposes. I've stood on the top of the pile at Torness. Nuclear has no fear for me, but on the other hand, nobody will commercially pick up the risk of the whole life for nuclear. In this area, with a good prospect of commercial success, nuclear, after decades, remains entirely unproven. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Many thanks. Now call on Lewis MacDonald to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
I think, Presiding Officer, we've already heard this afternoon that the debate on carbon capture and storage has moved on already beyond the issue of whether it is desirable to the issue of whether it can practically be delivered at scale in a sustainable way, and if so, when and where that should be done. There has developed a general view, indeed a consensus among most parties at both Holyrood and Westminster in recent years, that this is a technology which is worth taking forward for both environmental and economic reasons. Of course, there will be debate about how best to support projects, about which part of this technology to do first and where to start, but the principle is widely agreed. Capturing carbon from electricity generation can be done, and storing it securely can help to reduce levels of CO2 in the atmosphere and reduce the damage caused by climate change. More than that, whatever the source of the carbon, the North Sea does offer the best opportunities for storage in Europe, and Scotland, I think, is particularly well placed to provide storage for carbon captured both in Great Britain and indeed further afield. There are arguments about whether captured carbon should be used to enhance oil recovery, as we've already heard today. I think there is much less dispute about the security of depleted oil and gas reservoirs offshore or saline aquifers as a safe place of storage for captured carbon. With other members, I've had the opportunity to hear firsthand from project leaders twice in recent weeks, 3 weeks ago in Aberdeen and this week here in Edinburgh. You wait a long time for a briefing on carbon capture then, just like buses, to come along at once. Clearly, there is something going on. And as Patrick Harvey said, this is not the first time we have debated the merits of carbon capture and storage in this Parliament, although previously we have done so in the context of the wider energy debate, including in particular the inquiry into Scotland's energy future carried out by the Energy, Enterprise and Tourism Committee during the last Parliament. As part of that inquiry, I went with colleagues to Germany and visited the pioneering carbon capture plant at die Schwarzepumpe in the brown coal producing area of the former East Germany near the Czech and Polish borders. That plant was already pioneering the technical feasibility of carbon capture in the days of the former East Germany, but they had a problem, and they still had a problem when we visited, of how to transport the carbon without emitting more of it and where to store it. And a number of European countries, as Stuart Stevenson said, have still not found a solution that they are happy with to those problems, and clearly we have a solution to that in the North Sea and in the existing pipeline network. And just as offshore oil fields, which have produced hydrocarbons, can now provide storage for captured carbon, so pipelines which have taken oil and gas ashore and carried it to Grangemouth or to St Fergus can now be used to carry carbon in the opposite direction. So Scotland and the UK have, I think, a big advantage in the potential for carbon transport and storage. And for those, the timing is also very good. Offshore operators are now beginning the complex and costly business of decommissioning redundant fields and equipment. That creates new opportunities for Scottish engineering companies. It will also sharply reduce future government revenues as a result of tax breaks on decommissioning costs. It is timely, therefore, to be considering how to reuse and recycle offshore pipelines and platforms to support the new business of carbon transport and storage. Delaying some aspects of decommissioning will spread the costs for both operators and government and extend the life of the offshore sector as a whole. And if the North Sea and its associated infrastructure provide a competitive edge in the transport and storage of carbon, the capture of carbon, as has been said, has been proven in a technical sense, but now needs to demonstrate that it can be commercially sustainable and efficient at scale. And that is the next challenge to be met. Successive UK governments have offered real financial incentives for carbon capture demonstration schemes. Something like £1 billion is currently the prize for the successful developer. And as we have heard, Shell's Peterhead project is one of the 2 preferred bidders in that competition, aiming to capture carbon from an existing gas-fired station and to store it in the Golden Eye field offshore. Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce called this week for full support from both the UK and Scottish governments, pointing out the benefits for the North East, but also pointing out that this would be the first industrial-scale, full-chain CCS facility at a gas-fired power plant anywhere in the world and a global landmark project. And there is every possibility of Peterhead securing at least half of the £1 billion for a project giving the UK a global lead, though of course it should be noted that Scotland will have to be part of the UK for that to happen. The Captain project at Grangemouth is based on the German gasification technology we saw at the Schwarzepumpe at a new-build coal-fired power station, and is looking for contract price support from government rather than capital funding. And the hydrogen that will produce as part of the gasification process could have a number of uses, not least powering public transport fleets on the model of the hydrogen buses project currently being piloted by Aberdeen City Council with Scottish Government support. There is clearly a strong argument for taking forward coal and gas CCS at the same time. I hope that approach will find support from government at every level. I hope too that Scottish ministers will keep their carbon capture roadmap up to date in light of developments over the last 2 or 3 years, and that if they do so, carbon capture and storage can continue to command broad support in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thanks. And I call on Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Nigel Dawn. 6 minutes, please, or thereby.
Presiding officer, in May 1979, the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association measured atmospheric carbon dioxide levels at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii at just under 340 parts per million. In May of this year, levels reached their highest point in human history at 400 parts per million. This reminds us yet again of the impact human activity has had and continues to have on our environment. The Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 set ambitious emissions reduction targets of 42% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. If we are to reach these ambitious goals, it is important to pursue new technologies. Carbon capture and storage is one such technology. It is a step forward and could be an important investment in the future of Scotland. The potential for a thriving CCS programme is massive, using the industry, skills and expertise that already exist here in Scotland. If properly integrated into Scotland's evolving energy sector, carbon capture and sequestration could harness not only an energy-secure future, but our capacity to be a global policy leader and to set new energy industry standards. Scotland is ideal for this type of development. The central North Sea, as we've heard, possesses geological assets highly compatible with optimal use of existing infrastructure, offering a strong competitive edge. Before the CCS project was cancelled there, I visited not Germany but Longanet with representatives of Fairlight, Largs and West Kilbride community councils. 64 people were then employed on the project. CCS was being delivered, but 1 tonne of coal had to be used to clean 3 tonnes of coal. Different amine solutions were being tested to make the ratio a much more commercially viable ratio of 1 tonne to clean 7. Of course, CCS has to be the right investment in the right place, and I'm pleased, therefore, that Hunterston, in my own constituency, where a CCS coal plant, which would only be 25% CCS, in fact, was planned, is no longer being considered. And that issue, I believe, touches on what was said by Patrick Harvey earlier on, because that project would have meant 75% of the coal burned there would have not been clean, and we must be very wary that CCS projects do not go down this road, as Patrick Harvey has, of course, warned today. Today, crucial and welcome steps are being taken to realise the prospects of Peterhead, now preferred bidder for the £1 billion CCS commercialisation competition. Encouraging programmes such as this spur competition and ingenuity. Corporations such as Shell have been drawn to this project, which they believe has the potential to capture up to 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. Because of successes like this, it is necessary to incentivise schemes like the CCS commercialisation programme. Further successes include, as we've heard, the highly innovative Captain Clean Energy project, which involves the construction of a new integrated gasification combined cycle power plant at Grangemouth with a full 570 megawatt potential. Future implementations such as these offer a promising glimpse of the possibilities that CCS has to offer. According to DEC, Scotland uses more energy per capita than other parts of the UK, due, one suspects, to our colder climate primarily. In fact, DEC also found that in 2010, in a comparison of 12 regions and nations across the UK, Scotland ranked 5th highest in industrial and commercial gas usage. Additionally, further comparison of the aforementioned regions and nations also shows that in that same year, Scotland had the highest average domestic gas consumption per consumer at just below 16,000 kilowatt hours. Although part of an overall downward trend, these figures further emphasise the importance of the exploration of critical new technologies such as carbon capture and storage. Scotland has already demonstrated its carbon capture and storage potential, but now is the best way for us to realise the possibilities that CCS has to offer through commercial testing of these technologies. This is the most feasible way to benefit from CCS. Not only are there positive environmental impacts from this technology, but a marked economic benefit as well. It was estimated in a July 2012 report for Scottish Enterprise that CCS technology could produce an £11.3 billion increase in direct output for the Scottish economy. This report also found that CCS in Scotland can result in £2.7 billion of economic growth value added and potentially an additional 5,300 jobs. However, these figures can only be realised with the commercial development of this technology. The International Energy Agency estimates that global consumption of coal in 2017 will reach 4.32 billion tonnes, making coal the primary source of energy on Earth. Commercialisation of carbon capture and sequestration projects are not just an opportunity for Scotland, but for the UK and the wider world to reduce the polluting nature of coal. It is crucial that investments like the CCS commercialisation programme and developments that move away from traditional burning of coal towards clean processes like gasification are celebrated and encouraged. Auspicious plans and proposals for the development of CCS have established that Scotland has the requisite skills, industry, know-how and capability to become a serious competitor and pioneer in this industry. The energy market is changing, Presiding Officer. CCS has showed its promising prospects and a place within the Scottish economy. This technology is vital in meeting carbon reduction standards, vital to our future with regard to power supply in Scotland and the UK, and vital to the future of the environment. Regarding new nuclear, as it's been touched on, Presiding Officer, and as I too have a nuclear power station in my constituency, I am concerned with regard to Mr Gray's proposal for new nuclear, which I believe is hard to rationalise. EDF's call for a strike price twice the market price goes against, I believe, the Labour Party's recent pledge to freeze electricity prices. And as my colleague pointed out, Stuart Stevenson, the issue for nuclear really is commerciality. No nuclear power stations have been built in the USA for 41 years, primarily for this reason. And we already know that Hinkley Point, which will cost £14 billion, is 5 years late. Nuclear, I'm afraid, has no future, not just because of the environmental concerns about waste, which will last 250,000 years, but simply it cannot compete economically at this time. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Nigel Dawn to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to take just one step back, if colleagues will allow me, and to ask ourselves why it is that we've got this problem in the first place. Why is it that we actually need to produce carbon dioxide? It's a question that perhaps ought to be addressed at least once on the record. I would make the point that the major technologies for renewable energy, which are wind, wave, tidal and photovoltaic, have the ability to take movement or sunlight and turn it into electricity and, incidentally, a bit of heat without us having to burn anything. That's what distinguishes them and makes them so attractive from the fossil fuels, gas, oil, coal or wood, which we have heretofore burned in order to get heat. And of course, we've produced carbon dioxide in the process. Why do we need heat? Well, apart from the low-grade heat that keeps us warm, if you want to move something, like a car with a car engine, the higher that temperature, which the car engine actually gets to, the more efficient it is. The higher the temperature you can reach in a conventional power station, the more efficient it is. So you want hot heat, and that's about burning fossil fuels. Now, until we can actually produce everything else that we need from the renewables, we are going to have to be using some of that fossil fuel to generate hot heat, to generate the electricity which we need. We don't have any options. That really is the size of it. What you can do in any thermodynamic process is actually described by the laws of thermodynamics. I'm not going to worry about them now, but I want to pick up on a point which Patrick Harvey first articulated, and which I think others may need to address, which is, do we know whether the process of carbon capture and storage is actually energy effective? Is it efficient? Is it capable of actually storing this waste without expending as much energy in the process? And the answer, though I haven't seen the sums, must be yes, because my chemical engineering colleagues and others will have done those sums. They can be done. It is perfectly straightforward. All the numbers will be known. And what the laws of thermodynamics do enable you to do is to work out what is possible, because it's very good at telling you what is not possible. So I am quite confident, even without seeing the numbers, that the process could be made to work. But could I also make a couple of other points? The first is that we do need to be very careful, which is to remember, and there's an example, and I'm doing it now, I'm breathing. We have to remember that in all these processes, you don't get 100%. I'm breathing in some oxygen, it's about 20% of the atmosphere. I'm breathing out carbon dioxide. I don't breathe out all the carbon dioxide that's in my blood. I can't. A little bit of it's got to stay for the next passage through. Any process of trying to get carbon dioxide out of a flue gas is not going to achieve 100%. I think we just need to be aware of that, 1995, 90x, but it's never going to be 100%. Secondly, could I make the point that there is a difference between gas and coal? And again, people might just want to reflect on this. Coal is roughly CH2. Forgive me for the schoolboy chemistry. That means that when you burn it, you get 1 molecule of carbon dioxide and 1 molecule of water. Natural gas is CH4. That means when you burn it, you get 1 molecule of carbon dioxide and 2 molecules of water. The carbon dioxide is thereby inevitably more dilute. Now, that makes a point, which I think Stuart Stevenson pointed out, which is that one of the things we haven't done on a large scale, as I understand it, is actually to fit this to the flue gas from a gas plant. And it is materially different, even if it's just carbon dioxide and water. So that's one of the extremely good reasons why Peterhead should be the next opportunity that's taken. I'd like to just pick up on a couple of other things which I know are going on. Comment has already been made about Scottish carbon capture and storage and Professor Stuart Hazeldine. There are some enormously important things that need to be done when you're looking at any process. I never worked in the energy industry, but even detergents have their interesting bits. It's only by building something at scale that you discover how it really works, and it's only by building it at scale that you can make it cheaper. There are limits to what you can model. And that is why I think it's hugely important that we recognize we do need large schemes. The first one is the most expensive. The second one might well be 25%, 30%, conceivably 50% cheaper, I suppose, just because you've discovered how to do it the first time round. So please do not underestimate the absolute urgent need of building the first one and recognizing that it almost certainly needs to be subsidized because it will be nothing like as cost effective as it might be. Secondly, can I note that even once you've got that built, you've then got a lot of work to do to improve it, to optimize it. Again, chemistry is perfectly straightforward. When we had to write it at school on bits of paper, when you've actually got molecules moving around through bits of equipment, there are some things that you only learn at that stage. And that, again, has to be done, or we won't be able to develop it and turn it into an economic product. I also note that there are a huge number of other things that need to be done to work out the legal framework, the licensing framework, the environmental and economic framework. And I'm very glad to report, and the others have already mentioned this, that a lot of that work is being done in Scotland. I think we should be very proud of that. I'm sure we should continue to support that. The government, I know, is. And we need to make sure that that kind of thing is done in parallel with somehow or other making sure that a big plant is built in Scotland so we do the research, we gain the advantage of having done so. And it really would be an extremely good idea, and with this I finish, Presiding Officer, that it comes to Peterhead, because actually fitting it onto a gas plant is one of the crucial steps for the planet. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. I now call on Margaret McDougall to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Carbon capture and storage is a subject which I have had dealings with both in my committees within this Parliament and at a local level when Ayrshire Power had a proposal to develop an experimental carbon capture and storage plant at Hunterston in North Ayrshire. The problem with the Hunterston development was that the proposal was only partial CCS to start with, to be converted to full capacity CCS at some point in the future. Concerns were raised about the success of the method of conversion and the costs associated with storing the captured carbon, not to mention the lack of information on environmental impact. These plans were highly controversial, receiving over 20,000 objections, and they were refused by the North Ayrshire Planning Authority, and eventually were withdrawn by Ayrshire Power, who cited the current market and lack of funding opportunity as the reasons for the withdrawal. At the same time, they withdrew their submission to the UK Government CCS commercialisation competition, which would have awarded a £1 billion grant to develop a site with a 90% carbon capture and storage. The Longannet project also had to withdraw for economic reasons. I am pleased, however, that the CCS commercialisation competition has since moved on and that Peterhead is now listed as one of the preferred bidders. If the Peterhead bid was accepted, it could create up to around 1,000 jobs in the North East. The plant would also be the first of its type in the world. As Norway had to abandon its plan for a full-scale carbon capture and storage plant at its Mongstad oil refinery. This was after their government determined it would be too costly, and concerns were raised over the difficulties and timescales involved in development. If the technology proves to be viable, this would be a great achievement for Scotland, and it would be in line with our goal to create greener energy technology. It would also help the shift towards decarbonisation, helping us to meet our carbon reduction target, which we have so far failed to meet. Clearly, we need to up our game if we aim to achieve the 2030 target to slash 80% of carbon emissions produced from electricity generation. However, we can't be too reliant on CCS in case this technology fails to deliver, as has already been mentioned today, or the bid runs into problems. We also can't depend on CCS-ready plants, as there are no assurances this technology will work, as it's still under development. So we do need a realistic plan B, as Mr Fraser and some others have mentioned. That said, I welcome the Government's motion placed before us today that shows support for the Peterhead scheme. However, I note it is critical of the timescales involved, which, according to the House of Commons Library, are as follows: the signature of front-end engineering and design contracts by summer 2013, final investment decision from DEC on up to 2 projects by early 2015, and operational by 2016-2020. Like the Government motion, I also have concerns over these timescales, though I would imagine it is for a different reason. I wonder if the Minister could enlighten us to whether this development and independence are compatible, because it seems to me that given this is UK money, a yes vote in the referendum could put this project at serious risk. Why would a government award what would essentially be a competing foreign power £1 billion to develop technology when that investment could be put into their own power stations? Can the Minister tell Parliament today what discussions, if any, they have had with the UK Government regarding CCS commercialisation competition, or is this another case of don't ask the question and assume everything will be all right on the night? Unless, of course, the Scottish Government is going to pledge £1 billion to fund this project in the event UK funding is withdrawn. Or maybe more cynically, this is why the Scottish Government is asking the UK Government to hurry up and make its decision. As already noted, with many carbon capture and storage projects at a very early stage of technical development, funding is crucial because many companies are unable to provide the level of funding or don't want to take the risk. And I apologise, I wasn't able to attend the briefing this morning because of other parliamentary commitments. Furthermore, when countries such as Norway, which of course an independent Scotland is so often compared to, are deeming development too costly, I'm unsure how Scotland could go it alone in developing CCS technology. To conclude, Presiding Officer, this is a matter where Scotland is stronger together as part of the UK community. Scotland has a chance to be a world leader in CCS technology, and this is indeed an example of where we are distinctly better together. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Joan McAlpine to be followed by Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This week we are rightly celebrating the magnificent achievement of Professor Higgs of Edinburgh University being awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics. So it's appropriate to remember in this debate on CCS that another great name associated with Edinburgh was in fact the man who discovered carbon dioxide itself. Joseph Black, the Professor of Chemistry at both Glasgow and Edinburgh universities in the late 18th century, called the gas which resulted from the combustion of charcoal fixed air and noted that it supported neither flame nor animal life, a phrase that perhaps anticipates the threat CO2 emissions posed to our planet all these years later. Today, that brilliant Scottish Enlightenment professor fittingly gives his name to the £1 million Joseph Black Laboratory of Carbon Dioxide Chemistry, Edinburgh University's world-leading centre for carbon capture and storage. Thank you. Which was rightly singled out by the Minister in his opening speech. The Minister has talked about Scotland's comparative advantages in the field of CCS, and that was confirmed by the experts working in both Peterhead and Grangemouth projects who briefed us this morning. And by way of an aside, can I say how pleased I was to see that the briefing from the Shell project in Peterhead was written and presented by two female professionals, and I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Minister on his comments about women in the oil and gas industry that were reported in the press today. Along with existing infrastructure, oil and gas expertise and geological storage opportunities under the North Sea, we mustn't forget our academic excellence in this field. The Centre for Carbon Capture and Storage is the largest research group of its kind in the whole of the UK and acts as a bridge between academia, government and industry to form a single point of contact, not just in the geoscience and engineering required to make it happen, but also the legal and economic aspects of the technology and its environmental and social impact. The SCCS has worked closely with the Scottish Government and international partners, for example, in the US, South Korea and Norway, as well as the Global CCS Institute. The Centre has 60 business partners and it's currently undertaking work which could create thousands of jobs and add considerable to the wealth of our country, as the Minister has already, and others have already alluded to. Their work on enhanced oil recovery for the North Sea offers many opportunities. And that technology has already been used in North America. Put into practice in Scotland, the Centre's experts say that this technology could store 75 million tonnes of CO2 from power plants and increase the amount of oil produced from reservoirs beneath the North Sea by 5% to 25%. If I can quote Professor Stuart Hazeldine from SCCS, the North Sea is the most important CO2 storage region in the whole of the EU. So we propose that it is both possible and necessary to commence small injections of CO2 as soon as possible, to transfer capability from science to industry and build confidence. Professor Hazeldine has pointed out that government has a vital role to play in encouraging the development and incentivisation of CCS, and just last month urged delegates at the international conference on the subject in Edinburgh to urge policymakers across the European Union to seize that opportunity if Europe is to meet its targets for carbon reduction. It's important to emphasise that this is not a new or experimental technology, as some have suggested. In Norway, Sleipner was the world's first commercial CO2 storage project, and it's been going since the late 1990s. The natural gas produced from the Sleipner West field contains up to 9% CO2. However, in order to meet the required export specifications and the customer's requirements, this has to be reduced to a maximum of 2.5% CO2. The CO2 is removed from the produced hydrocarbons at an offshore platform before being pumped back into the ground and the hydrocarbons piped to land. Had this process not been adopted and the CO2 produced had been allowed to escape into the atmosphere, the licensees of the Sleipner West field would have had to pay 1 million Norwegian kroner a day in CO2 taxes, and I think that probably emphasises the importance of regulation and the role of the state in encouraging these kind of technologies. Similarly, those of us who attended the briefing this morning heard that the Summit Power Group, which has already been mentioned, one of the partners in the proposed Grangemouth project, already have the same technology up and running at their plant in Texas. Now, I'm not a geoscientist by any stretch of the imagination, but I was absolutely fascinated to hear the CEO of the Summit Power Group explain the technology that they're already using in Texas, and in particular the fact that they are removing the CO2 and other toxins without actually combusting the coal. And I was also very struck by what the COA said about their work with China. He talked about flying over China and seeing power stations that have numbers, not names, because the Chinese are building coal-fired power stations at a rate of 1 a week. And he concluded his remarks by saying the world will go on using coal and we have to find a way of using it more cleanly. And I think that is why this debate is very, very timely, and I hope that we will heed his words. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Now call on Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to start by adding my thanks to those of the Minister, to the good folk that gave us what was an excellent and very interesting briefing this morning, and that's reinforced my belief that carbon capture and storage is yet another exciting opportunity for Scotland, where once again we can be at the cutting edge of a new technology and leading the world in solving the climate change challenge, decarbonising our energy supply, providing energy security, keeping down energy prices, and providing new and high quality and rewarding careers. It's difficult not to like carbon capture and storage. It's difficult not to be enthusiastic about carbon capture and storage, and it's difficult not to see the immense opportunity that this represents for Scotland. And once again, I'm reminded of that great English economist, David Ricardo, and his theory of competitive advantage. And there is no doubt at all, Presiding Officer, that this is yet another area where Scotland has an obvious competitive advantage. Our depleted oil and gas fields offer the perfect opportunity for sequestrating CO2. The geological conditions are right. We have the technological skills and capacity to make this happen. And we have the academic knowledge base that can ensure that it's done well and done safely. The risk of leakage is non-existent. The pipelines are in place. It's merely a matter of utilising existing technology and skills in a new way. And that's not to say that there are not some challenges to overcome. But I've got no doubt, Presiding Officer, no doubt at all that Scotland's engineers and Scotland's academics can rise to these exciting challenges, because it's important that we demonstrate carbon capture and storage in commercial operation as soon as we can reasonably do so. The main challenge, however, is for us as politicians to recognise the very significant opportunity offered and to put aside any small differences and work together to make this happen. And that's why I'm keen to see the results of the UK Government's competition and to see the Peterhead project being given the green light. And that's why I'm very keen, if possible, to see the competition widened to include more than 2 preferred bidders. And the Captain Clean Energy project should be the perfect candidate. And that's why, if this is not possible, I'd like to see some form of contracts for difference incentive for carbon capture and storage projects as part of the energy market reform going through the UK Parliament. Presiding Officer, good government is about good economic stewardship. It's about maximising our economic opportunities. It's about maximising our competitive advantages. It's not about letting the grass grow under our feet and seeing other countries reap these opportunities. And there is a wider point here. It's about pioneering these technologies where it makes sense for us to do so, not just for Scotland's economic advantage, but to play our part as a responsible nation, helping to solve the global problems of climate change by leading the way and showing other countries how to do so. As Joan McAlpine has just said, China is building a new coal-fired power station every week. Perhaps that's a thought that Mr Harvey should reflect upon. The Captain Clean Energy project offers a unique opportunity of demonstrating to the world how coal gasification works, removing the noxious chemicals and carbon both before and after combustion. With coal responsible for the largest proportion of worldwide CO2 emissions, this technology paves the way for removing 90%, perhaps more than that, of CO2 from our energy production. But it's also about doing this responsibly, doing it in a way that doesn't throw thousands of people out of work, doing it in a way that instead creates economic opportunity, and doing it in a way that keeps the lights on and provides affordably warm and healthy homes here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, Scotland has got world-leading climate change legislation. We have a world-leading wave and tidal research sector. We can have world-leading carbon capture and storage too.
Many thanks. Now call on Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Agnes MacDonald. There is a little time in hand if people want to use it to make interventions. Liam MacArthur, 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I think this has been an impressively constructive debate where even areas of disagreement have been expressed in measured tones. I think the Minister very much led by example in that respect. I think if this is the way we respond to be giving our first opportunity to debate carbon capture and storage as an issue in its own right, then perhaps we should be doing it rather more often. In terms of the Government's motion, the content of that I generally welcome, though it does stray in a couple of areas and would benefit from the suggested amendments by Murdo-Fraser, and I hope the Minister may yet be persuaded in the spirit of sustaining the consensus I know he has worked very hard to try and maintain on this issue. Before turning to CCS itself and whether and how the technology might be deployed, I think it is essential to set the debate in its proper context, as Ian Gray, Kenny Gibson, Patrick Harvey and others have done. Fundamentally, it is about addressing the challenge of climate change, taking the necessary steps to decarbonise our economy, and doing so quickly enough to enable us to avoid the tipping point in terms of temperature rises. That is why Liberal Democrats are absolutely committed to achieving zero net greenhouse gas emissions from the UK economy by 2050. Challenging though it may be, this goal is entirely achievable. It will require concerted action across a number of fronts, but if we are to improve energy efficiency, reduce fuel consumption and lower greenhouse gas emissions, we will clearly need to develop and commercialise new technologies in renewable energy, carbon capture and storage and low-carbon modes of transport. Of course, pinning all our hopes on technology getting us out of the hole we've got ourselves into would be misguided. Significant behavioural changes will also be necessary. In some cases, we may just need to recognise that the only option is to stop doing things. But given the trajectory required in reducing emissions and the continued role that thermal power will need to play in our energy mix, over the next decades. I firmly believe that both Scotland's governments are right to be looking to CCS as a means of making the sort of changes we see in the timeframes necessary. I note WWF's concerns about what it sees as the Scottish Government's, quote, over-reliance on CCS in its latest report on proposals and policies for delivery of our climate change targets. WWF calls in its briefing for a Plan B. However reasonable and beguiling that call may be, though, there is a risk that it sends out a confused message, diverting investment and focus away from the development of commercial-scale CCS. The consequence of this would be that we then either miss our targets or find ourselves importing in the technology and expertise we need at a later date. That, I thought, was the unambiguous message from Professor Hazeldine of Edinburgh University briefings earlier this week. And I'll give way to Patrick Harvey.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member giving way. If the member's not so comfortable with the language of a Plan B, would he acknowledge, for example, that we need to be willing to contemplate a range of scenarios for when this technology may become commercially deployable? It might happen in the 2020s, or the 2030s, or the 2040s, and we need to plan for all of those scenarios.
MacArthur.
I don't think that's an unreasonable proposition, but I think the message that I gain from what we've seen in terms of the development of renewables is that it is important to set ambitious targets and to be clear and consistent in the steer that we give to industry so that they can respond and put the investment behind that steer. So what are the steps being taken to ensure that we don't find ourselves in either of these positions? Well, as the Minister confirmed to Parliament recently, deployment of CCS at commercial scale will largely be driven by the carbon price floor, support through contracts for difference under the EMR process, and by the UK's CCS commercialisation programme competition. To that, I would add the important contribution the UK's 4-year R&D programme will make, £125 million of funding to support around 100 projects, many of them at Scottish universities such as Edinburgh, Heriot-Watt and Strathclyde, aimed at reducing the costs of CCS by developing cheaper and more efficient technologies and components, as well as characterising storage sites. But the heavy lifting, as the Minister has already said, is being done through contracts for difference and the commercialisation programme. On the former, I know there have been concerns expressed about uncertainty created by the EMR process. I can understand that to an extent, though I don't think anybody realistically expected this to be a simple or a straightforward process. I'm pleased, though, that we are now seeing some of the necessary clarity around CFDs. They will encourage investment in renewable technologies and CCS by reducing risks to investors and making it easier and cheaper to secure finance, as reflected in Murdo Fraser's amendment. I was interested to hear the representatives of Summit Power this week talking rather optimistically about the potential effects CFDs could have on helping deliver their Captain Clean Energy project at Grangemouth, and that is certainly very encouraging. Of course, Captain is also one of 2 reserve projects in the UK Government's commercialisation programme, for which SSE and Shell's project at Peterhead is the preferred bidder, as others have mentioned. While this, as we know from experience at Longannet, offers no guarantees, it does confirm that the Peterhead bid is well placed, and this is excellent news for Scotland, as the Minister acknowledged. The £1 billion capital fund aims to support the design, construction and operation of commercial-scale CCS, and hopefully will see Peterhead emerge successful from this competitive process. I appreciate that there was disappointment that the previous competition did not result in deployment at Longannet, but for many of the reasons outlined by Murdo Fraser earlier in his contribution, this was a point reached, I think, in mutual agreement between Scottish Power and its partners and the UK Government. And those, I think, tempted to lambast UK ministers for not stumping up whatever money was needed to make CCS happen at Longannet rather missed the point about demonstrating the viability of commercial-scale CCS. Deputy Presiding Officer, I do believe that CCS should be part of our efforts to reduce our own emissions, but we should also not lose sight of its importance to global efforts to tackle climate change, as I think Joan McAlpine mentioned in her contribution. It was put to me recently by one academic and an expert in the field that Peterhead and Captain are now a very significant part of global efforts to demonstrate the type of CCS power plant projects with CO2 storage that will be critical to achieve big global emissions reductions. Most other projects using existing CO2 sources from gas cleaning processes and commercial CO2 injection. All of this, of course, is contingent upon reaching a global agreement, but Scotland has a large proportion of the EU storage capacity, as well as the industrial clusters, relevant expertise in the oil and gas sector, and academic excellence, all of which can help us reap significant economic benefits. Indeed, with Scotland and the UK now carrying a disproportionate burden in demonstrating CCS on behalf of the EU, I wonder whether the Minister would consider whether CCS electricity should be counted against our EU renewable targets. This is not without its problems, I suspect, but certainly it would help enhance the viability of the technology. Deputy Presiding Officer, in closing, again, I welcome today's debate and the way in which the Minister has set the tone. I acknowledge the general consensus about the importance of CCS in helping deliver our emissions reduction and climate change targets, as well as those on a global scale, and the advantages that Scotland has in this field. And on that basis, I hope the Minister will accept the amendment in the name of Murdo Fraser so that we can convey that sense of common purpose. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Angus MacDonald to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to debate carbon capture and storage in the Chamber this afternoon, not least because the issue is of particular significance for me, as my Falkirk East constituency is a potential location for possibly the UK's first carbon capture and storage system at Grangemouth. Now, as we've heard already, if the Captain Clean Energy CCS project does go ahead, it will see the construction of a 570 megawatt integrated gasification combined cycle power plant, which will be one of the world's cleanest and most efficient power stations, virtually identical to the other Summit power plant in Texas. Once operational, it will produce enough power to heat and light 1 million homes, while the CO2 that's normally released into the atmosphere will be captured, transported along an existing pipeline and stored deep under the seabed in the central North Sea. What's not to like, to coin a phrase? Not only could the scheme put Grangemouth on a global map when it comes to showing how to get clean energy from coal, the £2 billion project, with an estimated construction period of 48 months, could also create around 300 permanent jobs and around 2,000 during the construction period, as the Energy Minister has already alluded to. But the benefits of CCS are not simply the direct economic benefits from the projects at Grangemouth or Peterhead. The technology as a whole has the potential to deliver ultra-low carbon power to the grid at a cost that is very competitive with offshore wind. It has to be said, therefore, that the decision in late 2011 by the UK Government to ditch plans for the Longannet CCS project following disagreement between the UK Treasury and DEC over the necessary funding was a blow to the potential economy of Fife and the wider Forth Valley. We are therefore extremely fortunate to still have both the Peterhead and Grangemouth projects on the table. Certainly.
Liam McCarthy.
I'm very grateful to Angus MacDonald for taking an intervention. He will have heard Murdo Fraser's explanation of some of the rationale behind the decision not to proceed at Longannet, a decision that was accepted in agreement by Scottish Power and the other members of that consortium. On that basis, does he think it's helpful to attribute the blame to somehow an attitude in HM Treasury that it's not supportive of CCS?
Angus MacDonald.
I think the blame should be shared. Clearly, there was an issue between DEC and the Treasury. However, I totally accept that there were operational and technical difficulties as well. To help meet our carbon emission targets, we must move ahead with these projects at a pace, and more projects coming forward would clearly be welcomed on a cross-party basis. As we've heard from previous speakers, carbon capture and storage is an industrially proven group of technologies which can reduce the emissions associated with electricity generation from fossil fuel power plants by over 90%. There is, of course, the added benefit that given the geographic position of the pipeline heading north from Grangemouth, there's future possibility for industrial plants along or nearby the route of the pipeline to capture their CO2 and send it to storage rather than continue with emissions. CCS, coupled with the extensive deployment of renewables, can be used together to meet emissions reductions targets and set standards which can make a significant contribution to providing clean, reliable energy whilst mitigating the worst effects of climate change. Now, we've heard already this afternoon that the captured CO2 can be used for enhanced oil recovery while being stored underground. As I understand it, there's currently no enhanced oil recovery opportunity with the proposed Captain Clean Energy CCS project at the moment. However, there are many existing oil fields in the immediate vicinity that could significantly benefit economically from enhanced oil recovery were there a significant supply of CO2 available. It's estimated, however, that if EHR was to be incorporated in the Summit Power Captain Clean Energy project, it could recover 30,000 barrels of oil a day. As we've heard, this is not music to the Green Party's ears. However, most Scots, I believe, will welcome that prospect. However, I do understand and follow Mr Harvey's argument, although I don't agree with it. Yes. Sorry, Mr Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member. I wonder if he agrees with the Climate Change Minister, who accepts that Scotland cannot afford to use all of the fossil fuel reserves that we have. How much unburnable carbon does Mr MacDonald think Scotland has? How much must we leave in the ground unused?
Angus MacDonald.
Well, we have a significant amount in the ground. We're not saying that we're going to be using it all, but we have to take into account the economic benefits that EHR would bring at the moment. And I do stress, I do see where you're coming from. However, the economic benefits...
Through the Chair, please, Mr MacDonald.
Sorry,
thank you.
The economic benefits are, of course, have to be taken into account. A good North Sea oil field may be capable of economically extracting 50% of the oil originally in place. So for every barrel of oil produced, another's left on the ground. As we know, injecting CO2 can change this and increase the proportion of oil recovered whilst also safely storing CO2. According to a 2012 Element Energy report commissioned by Scottish Enterprise, 19 oil fields in the UK continental shelf have a combined potential incremental oil recovery of 2.5 billion barrels of oil, associated with storage in the region of 0.8 gigatons of CO2. This would have a significant impact on the oil sector and significantly strengthen Scotland's energy market. There is, of course, a counter-argument to the benefits of CCS. Those against the technology will say that fossil fuels will never be clean. At the point of extraction or due to transportation, fossil fuel power plants have an impact on our environment. CCS, described in the Scottish Government's power sector policy, places a significant assumption on the technology being both economically and technically viable. This situation is not helped by the fact that current proposals under UK electricity market reform are likely to lead to a dash for gas, undermining efforts to test and deploy CCS at a commercial scale. So I cannot and will not disagree with that viewpoint, and I'd like to see 100% of Scotland's energy generated from renewables, but we have to accept reality that before we meet that target, almost a third of the UK's ageing and inefficient power plants are scheduled for decommissioning. Simply put, we need to keep the lights on, although there's clearly a much greater chance of the lights going out in England than in Scotland.
Could you draw to a close, please,
which is hopefully helping to concentrate the minds of DEC. In coming to a close, unfortunately, I had quite a bit to say. Another benefit is that coal also enables greater security of supply and price control. With its existing infrastructure and skills in the North Sea, Scotland also has a massive opportunity to demonstrate progress and export expertise abroad, accelerating decarbonisation on a global scale. In closing, Presiding Officer, can I welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to carbon capture and storage and the acknowledgement that it is a critical component in the decarbonisation of Scotland's energy supplies. Let's get moving on this exciting technology without any further delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Of course, members are in broad agreement that any measures that we can make to mitigate the effects of climate change by reducing carbon emissions is to be welcomed. In this chamber, that goes almost without saying, although there still seem to be some climate deniers, not least a small smattering of them in the Tory party, but I see the only Tory leaving the chamber, but never mind. It is an unfortunate fact of life that as things stand, a high proportion of our global energy needs need to be met by the burning of a variety of fossil fuels, meaning the CO2 for now is inevitable. As members have stressed, as we make a just transition to a low-carbon economy, it does make sense to prevent the release of CO2 as best we can. And the recent debate on open cast mining shows that this shift will be a slow incremental process with whole communities to consider as we progress. Storing the CO2 release from the utilisation of coal and gas does seem like a viable short-term solution, especially considering that the most common fossil fuel used for industry in Scotland coal is obtained through open cast mines, being one of the dirtiest sources of energy available. Reports indicate that pre-combustion capture of carbon through the treatment of coal can reduce emissions by over 90%, which I'm sure members agree is very encouraging. However, these benefits are tempered by the fact that the capture at the power plant requires, I understand, between 10 and 40% more power to run, which does raise questions over the efficiency of the technology, a concern raised by Greenpeace, among others. I was interested to hear in the debate today about the methods of carbon capture, which have actually been widely used in the oil and gas industries for many years. But this was primarily for the purpose of enhancing oil and gas recovery, perhaps a point that even my colleague Patrick Harvey might agree with, in view of the fact that it might prevent us going to further reserves and actually extracting more from present reserves. The use of the existing technology, which can be used to retrofit existing power plants, allowing their companies to filter their emissions through post-combustion, is one option, as we have heard. However, I would be more encouraged by the possibility of the pre-combustion option, as this is a closed system, and SEPA have raised concerns in relation to air quality and post-combustion in the failed Hunterston application, as this process results in the releasing of amines, as I understand, a chemical which could be harmful. Yes.
Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you for taking an intervention. I too am quite attracted to pre-combustion, but does the member take account of the very substantial amount of oxygen that needs to be produced by chemical processes for pre-combustion process, which in itself has its own set of problems? In other words, as in engineering in any other area, as in this area, there are always pluses and minuses to almost any solution you choose to come up with.
Claudia Beamish.
I absolutely agree that there are always pluses and minuses, and I'm not an engineer or a scientist, but in the production of the hydrogen, I believe there is the production of the oxygen as well. So that is an issue to be discussed in the future, and I think this is one of the points that highlight the importance of research and careful monitoring of the first preferred bid, which I hope will be Peterhead. According to the Captain Clean Energy Project, who are the beneficiaries who may be the beneficiaries, I apologise, Scotland is ideally placed in geological terms to take advantage of CCS, and the existing pipework in the North Sea, as we've heard from others, can serve as a ready-made infrastructure, although I would stress the need to assess the potential risks of piping such large amounts of CO2 through the sea, again a research issue. While I welcome this move towards CCS in theory, I would emphasise that any research into the widespread use should not be at the expense, in my view, of the development of sustainable renewable energy production, and the development of transferable skills is essential for renewables and CCS. And we should also, at this point, recognise the support of the UK government in the development of CCS and renewables. The Climate Justice Conference, which I attended yesterday, highlighted concerns about fossil fuels. Worldwide, there will be opportunities to export our technology and expertise to countries where fossil fuels are still a substantial part of the energy mix. On this note of optimism, though, after Joan McAlpine's and others' remarks, which I completely agree with, about concerns of fossil fuel in China, there are also substantial renewables developments in China, which is perhaps a cause for optimism. The long-term effects of climate change are indeed very real. We must not be lulled into a false sense of security through measures such as CCS. The fact remains that the continued use of fossil fuels is unsustainable in the long term, and I think the future focus on capture-ready stations might be a step in the wrong direction, as echoed by RSPB. I was interested to hear of the CCS guidelines from the Minister. Before carbon capture is to be fully embraced, I would argue that a number of questions need still to be answered, and perhaps the Minister can provide some clarity on developments. The Captain Clean Energy Project has assured us that the storage in rock formation would be safe, as there are many naturally occurring accumulations of CO2 in rock, but I wonder how much research has been done on this. And secondly, could the pumping into the seabed have any detrimental effect on marine wildlife? That's another question. Of course, we must not forget there are other forms of recapturing carbon from the atmosphere, and research needs to go into those as well. Green and blue carbon sinks are an essential part of carbon capture as well, and I know the Minister for Environment and Climate Change has plans to look at the benefits of this. On the RPP, I am concerned to stress a note of caution about the reliance on carbon capture in relation to clean energy, because I wonder whether the potential gains of this technology have informed the government's predictions for emissions in the coming years.
I'm afraid you must draw to a close,
Right,
please.
thank you. While carbon capture certainly has the potential to hit our emissions targets, I would not like to think that it is afforded undue significance in the transition to a low-carbon economy, which it could indeed, in the long term, delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Chick Brodie to be followed by Christian Allard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If I may, I'd like to follow the quote that Stuart Stevenson made earlier from Professor Stuart Hazeldine, Research Director of SCCS. He said, experience worldwide and throughout history in developing new technologies shows that rapid learning and cost reduction comes from constructing and operating a series of medium-sized projects. He went on, bigger is not better. The Central North Sea can produce multiple CCS projects more quickly than anywhere else in the UK. Accessing the Central North Sea is easiest from Scotland and the northeast of England. It fulfills the UK's own needs and also opens a gateway to Europe to safeguard high-value jobs and provide long-term taxable revenue. I'm sure, Presiding Officer, that will be welcomed by all in this chamber and indeed in the UK. Our goals, Presiding Officer, our outcomes are quite clear. That Scotland seeks to have a balanced 100% renewable power generation electricity in the medium term, with that one component, electricity fully generated from renewable sources by 2020. That is accepted sine qua non, but as Scotland plans major decarbonisation and reduction in all thermal generation capacity, that plan sits easily along with CCS as a transitional and ongoing support technology. Our aim, Presiding Officer, is just that, to secure that support technology. As the Minister pointed out, there is an overarching need now for clarity over EMR policy and its objectives, and its hope for its audacity in seeking a better level of competitiveness, of competition, in securing this technology and in the delivery of CCS. We cannot sit like rabbits in the headlights of oncoming energy technology vehicles. We cannot be like Mr McCobber, we hope that something will turn up to marry our objectives of environmental and economic growths. We have to have a clear steer on where we want to go, and CCS is a key driver in that pursuit. So, Presiding Officer, going back to my opening quote, I applaud the kind of leadership shown by Professor Hazeldine, by the British Geological Society, the UK Government, and indeed our Minister, who at the SEC conference in Edinburgh called for a call to arms to delegates from Europe to recognise that decarbonisation will come not only from large projects, but from varied size projects, and so unlock the huge potential of North Sea's storage capacity. And we haven't even talked about the potential that exists in Scottish fields off the west coast, the Ayrshire coast and the lower Atlantic. That is for another day. Presiding Officer, in accepting the caveats that were introduced meaningfully by Mr Fraser and Mr Harvey regarding cost and the stage of development, I would say, however, that that conference that I referred to set down the marker that will support the type of needed vision and technological approach, and that indeed was mirrored by the recent signing of a memorandum of understanding between the CCS representatives of Scotland, of the UK and indeed of the Guangdong province in China. That will pave the way for the research, the development, the demonstration and knowledge exchange of innovative carbon capture, use and storage technologies. Scotland can then hopefully be in the van of becoming an exporter of CCS coal and gas technology expertise. SCCS has internationally renowned researchers and state-of-the-art facilities, but like any successful new technology, new business, new market, a limitation on competition may itself limit that much needed development. So we do have a potential positive pioneering advantage in this energy resource. We have the internationally respected research capability. We have the operational and technical skills gained from our many years involved in oil and gas industries. We have the physical infrastructure, particularly in relation to the aforementioned Central North Sea Storage Hub, to which, as I say, I referred. We have, Presiding Officer, preferred bid status, currently at Peterhead and Grangemouth, but we have the capacity and indeed the landfall to have more and smaller opportunities and to move these along much more quickly. What we don't have is an incentive, or indeed incentives, through meaningful application of an EMR-based CFD, contract for difference, to early development and crystallisation of this critical element of our energy plan and our energy future. I would hope that these projects might be suitable for Horizon 2020 funding, for example, a €70 billion fund that gets these major projects on the go quickly. Presiding Officer, it's a nonsense, indeed, an abhorrent nonsense, that a technology which can transform how we generate power, how we target carbon emissions, how we secure that power supply and indeed its storage, is not proceeding apace and apace quickly. It is sad that a potential real missed opportunity, that a technology which could increase direct output for our economy, the Scottish economy, by £11.3 billion, resulting in £2.7 billion of gross value add, and creating and supporting 5,000 jobs, as I say, is not proceeding apace.
Mr Brodie, you must come to a conclusion.
I'm coming to the end. This technology is a key ingredient to our power and carbon emission targets. More competition, smaller projects are also key to its development. We will have a balanced energy policy, but a balance that promotes CCS alongside the other sources of renewable technology. I beg your support.
Thank you very much. And finally, Chick Brodie. Sorry, Christian Allard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I believe that carbon capture and storage is a critical technology for Scotland's energy future. As a North East MSP, I welcomed the announcement of Peterhead Power Project as a preferred bidder. And we need to move forward, like many have said before me. We know how slow people in Whitehall can be, and we might get some encouragement listening to us all today. This is why I'm delighted to take part of this debate, adding my voice to many before me, supporting the project in the blue tune. As Professor Stuart Hazeldine, I shall stop there. Unfortunately, we are running out of quotes of Professor Hazeldine, so I will not be able to quote him, but I will back up all the quotes which I heard before me. Members would have heard me before, going on and on about the North East of Scotland being the powerhouse of the UK. Let me repeat the facts that we are blessed with so many natural resources, attracting many people from far and wide, adding to the excellent, skilled and highly educated people already living in the North East. Last week, I was privileged to welcome a delegation of French investors to the North East, led by the French ambassador from London. They were very impressed, Presiding Officer, with the quality and of the people working and living in the North East, particularly of the can-do attitude. And this can-do attitude, I believe, Presiding Officer, is not coming from the energy sector. I don't think it was when we discovered oil that we discovered that new can-do attitude. I think we had that before in the North East. We had that from the farming sector, from the fishing sector, and that is all about investment. It's about forecasting, having a vision of what you need to invest to be able to harvest in the sea or harvest in the land. And that's very, very important to understand the prosperity of the northeast of Scotland, how that came about. And of course, there was great excitement from the delegation, and for a very good reason. But there are already very good examples of companies from abroad coming and investing in the northeast. For example, as a French company, Total, have been investing £3.3 billion recently. You know, we're only talking about £1 billion, like Stuart Stevenson said before me. And so there is a lot of potential here in the northeast, and there is a lot of expertise and investments already. And how can we accommodate this carbon capture project? We can do it very easily, because of course we've got a project called Energetica, which is an energy corridor starting from Aberdeen and finishing in Peterhead. And this project is to attract cutting-edge companies and asking them to stay here, and to stay here in Scotland, and to retain them as that dynamic organisation. Because we've got competition, fierce competition across the world, and we need to understand that and secure our position as one of the world's leading locations for diverse modern energy industry. Energetica is our response to consolidate and build on our energy technology capability, developing of existing businesses, of course, and attracting inward investment to the northeast. And we need to develop this initiative, world-class business and recreation destination that will be an attractive place to live and to work. Now, I'll maybe take you, Presiding Officer, through the map from Aberdeen to Peterhead, from the Aberdeen Exhibition and Conference Centre, which of course hosts once every 2 years, offshore Europe. And I recommend members to attend offshore Europe if you've never been. You know, it's a revelation to see how much investments come to this country. If you go a little bit north, you see the Black Dog project with direct access to the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, which is going to be built shortly and only 10 minutes from the Aberdeen Airport. Then offshore, we will have another important EU-funded development project, the European Offshore Wind Development Centre. We heard in this chamber a lot about a completion of another project, a recreation project, next on the map, the best golf course in the world, some might say. You will find the Ocean Lab north of Newborough, the subsea research facility of the University of Aberdeen, where carbon capture storage technology is on the agenda. Next, to the existing Peterhead Energy Hub and Peterhead decommissioning, we have projects like the subsea transmission cable development, the offshore floating turbine centre, the Energetica Industry Park, the carbon importation hub, and of course, the projects, the carbon capture and storage project. When the idea of recovering North Sea oil was first discussed, Presiding Officer, there were those who argued it would be far too expensive. We would not have had North Sea oil today if we didn't have the positive vision required to attract the level of public and private investment needed. Let's not miss another opportunity to capitalise in the asset that we have, natural resources and the skills and expertise of our people in universities and across the energy sector. Presiding Officer, this Scottish Government has put the bar very high on what we can achieve in level of renewable energy. Let's encourage the UK's government today to follow our good example north of the border and to act swiftly. This huge opportunity cannot be allowed to pass us by. The North East of Scotland is a land of opportunity, Presiding Officer, the powerhouse of the UK. The energy sector is booming. Let's put carbon capture at the heart of our energy policy in Peterhead.
Thank you very much. We now turn to closing speeches, and I call on Patrick Harvey. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rarely come into the chamber with a pre-written speech. And when I have the opportunity to open and close on an amendment, I tend to start writing the notes for my closing speech once I've sat down on the opening speech. And what I decided to do this time was to draw my paper into 2 columns. And one of them I headed potential, and the other I headed assumptions, because I wanted to get a flavour for how much of this debate was being expressed in terms of what the potential of CCS may be, and how much of it was being expressed in terms of assumptions about what CCS will do. Because very often when we've debated this technology in the past, our debates have been riddled with fairly grandiose assumptions, either about the value in economic terms of all that lovely extra oil that will be pumped out through enhanced oil recovery, or of the number of jobs or of the value to the economy. Well, my columns are not a comprehensive record. I ran out of space fairly early on, but I think there's been a fair balance between these different forms of expression, recognising theoretical potential and claiming absolute certainty. There's been a bit of a balance. If anything that I have said in the opening part of this debate has helped to move us in the direction of being honest about potential, then I'll be happy about it. Ian Gray, I think, was the first member to speak in the open debate, and he talked about the potential role. And he contrasted that, I think, well with the very real, immediate, current impact of climate change. We can be sure of the one. We can't necessarily be sure of the other. Lewis MacDonald also asked a question about if the offshore industry gives us an edge in CCS. If that's the case, he said, there'll still be a need to demonstrate the technology on a commercial scale. We are still talking about potential.
Minister.
I mean, I appreciate Patrick Harvey's method of debating to address the topic in the debate, not prepare a speech in advance. Could I put it to him, therefore, that each of the components of carbon capture, storage and transportation are generally settled technologies, and what needs to be demonstrated is the application of all these technologies together?
Patrick Harvey.
I think Professor Frankenstein had a pretty clear understanding of how each of the components of the beast he was putting together worked. Putting the thing together is as much of a challenge, not an insurmountable challenge, but as much of a challenge as understanding any one component. There were some assumptions expressed. Nigel Donne was pretty clear and happy to admit, I think, that he was making an assumption that the efficiency and energy balance sums have been done by others. Well, I can say to Nigel Donne that I wouldn't agree to vote for a Scottish Government budget on that kind of basis, and I'm not going to agree to a Scottish Government energy policy on that kind of basis either. Mike McKenzie said, there is no doubt that Scotland has a competitive advantage. I think he used the phrase, the perfect opportunity. He said, we can have world-leading CCS. Well, there's a great big dose of maybe that needs to be included in statements like that. Kenny Gibson was one of those who did talk about the potential, as did Liam MacArthur, who said CCS should be part of our effort to reduce emissions. And I would agree with that statement very much. I'll take one more intervention.
Mike McKenzie.
I wonder if Mr Harvey would agree with me that that's the whole point of what we're debating, the need to get a demonstration project like Peterhead up and running so that we understand this whole area, you know, much more closely, take any remaining uncertainties, and I believe there are very few, but take them out of the equation.
Patrick Harvey.
And for the avoidance of doubt, I'll say it one more time. I support the work on exploring the viability and the efficiency of this technology and seeing a demonstration project in practice. I caution against using that potential as an excuse either for increasing fossil fuel extraction or fossil fuel use in the meantime. It's not just a question of whether this potential exists, but at what cost can it be realised? Cost in terms of money, in terms of energy, and in terms of carbon. And crucially, when? If we're able to deploy this technology at an industrial scale around 2030, then we'll be able to use it to help us meet those targets. If we're only able to deploy it at an industrial scale years or perhaps even a decade after that, then it's not something we can rely on a timescale that we invent or hope for. I don't have any strong objection, I have to say, to the Conservative amendment, but even if whether it passes or doesn't, I'm afraid I won't be supporting the government motion, principally because of the reference to enhanced oil recovery. And I come back to this question which I raised about unburnable carbon, because it fundamentally affects not only the SNP government's energy policy, but also its economic policy. Viewing oil always as a positive economic resource is an unsustainable position. It has a positive economic value if we use it within the limits that the challenge of climate change sets for us. If we use it beyond those limits, it has a negative economic value. It will destroy or contribute to the destruction of the environmental conditions that our economy depends on. Finally, in closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, can I just stress, CCS does have potential, but we must not see it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Even if it works reliably, safely, efficiently, it will only do so for a finite time. It may give us a bit more time for the fundamental and challenging changes that are needed in our lives, in our expectations of energy use, and in the nature of our economy. What it can never do is give us an excuse to defer those changes or hide from the need to begin them. They haven't yet begun to take place.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Murdo Fraser, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I started welcoming the positive tone of the debate. I'm very pleased that that positive tone generally continued for the rest of the 2.5 hours we have. In fact, I think we perhaps broke a record in the debate this afternoon in this session. We had to wait more than an hour before the question of independence was even mentioned in the debate, and that came from Margaret McDougall. And I think she was the only one, actually, who mentioned the constitutional question, which is very unusual, as we all know. Stuart Stevenson welcomed the UK government investment in Peterhead in his project. Even Mike Mackenzie abandoned his partisanship at the door today and encourages us all to work together. We had from Nigel Dawn a physics lesson, or maybe it was a chemistry lesson, or maybe it was both. Typically thoughtful contribution on the issue around the costs and necessity of experimental schemes. There's 2 or 3 points I want to pick up, Deputy Presiding Officer, that have been identified in the debate. The first, really, to seek some clarity from the Minister. Ian Gray picked up this particular point from the motion and from the Minister's opening remarks. The Minister's motion does refer to more than 2 bidders for the preferred bidders for the scheme. What I'm not clear is whether the Minister is calling for more money from the UK Government, or whether he wants to spread the cash more thinly, and perhaps when he's winding up he could just clarify that particular point for me. The second point, which is a bit of a running theme throughout the debate, and Patrick Harvey's just referred to it, is this question of the reliance on CCS. I did mention this in my opening remarks, and Patrick Harvey, Claudia Beamish, Lee MacArthur and others made reference to it. This is Patrick Harvey's Frankenstein monster in the debate. Now, we know that CCS is technically possible. The Minister was right to make that intervention. We know the elements are all technically possible. The question is not so much whether we can do it. The question is whether we can do it at economic cost. And this is really why the experimental projects are going ahead. CCS is not here yet. So it's an opportunity. It's a prospect. Now, we should be optimistic about this, because we're always optimistic. We're always looking forward. But just being optimistic about it doesn't make it going to happen. And that's why we need to be just a little bit cautious about this. And there is no plan B from the Scottish Government in terms of RPP2 if CCS does not work. Now, the Committee on Climate Change... Yes, of course.
Mike Mackenzie.
What Mr Fraser seems to be saying is related to something Mr Harvey was saying earlier on about having multiple plans to look at various scenarios. And I wonder if Mr Fraser would care to reflect on the situation if JFK had perhaps, instead of saying we're going to the moon, said, well, maybe we'll go to the moon, we might go to Mars, Jupiter, Pluto or whatever. Could that have resulted in nothing happening at all, rather than Neil Armstrong landing on the moon in 1969?
Murdo Fraser.
Well, I have the perfect answer for Mr Mackenzie, and I was just about to quote to him from the Committee on Climate Change in 2008, who addressed this very issue. And Patrick Harvey's going to love this, Deputy Presiding Officer. Ms Mackenzie will love it even more, because what they said was, and I quote, CCS is currently not a proven technology at full commercial scale. If it were unavailable at reasonable cost, the Markle model suggests that a huge expansion of nuclear power would be the least cost option. Not a prospect that concerns me, Deputy Presiding Officer, but perhaps Mr Harvey and Mr Mackenzie and the SNP benches might find that a bit too much for stomach. So the Minister better hope that it does work after all. Now, I want to touch briefly on another issue, that of the emissions performance standard for new fossil fuel power stations. This is mentioned in the briefing from RSPB, who say that the standards which are being set UK-wide, which the Scottish Government has accepted, are not currently high enough, and they want to argue for a higher Scottish standard for EPS. It brought back to my mind a very interesting exchange there was at the Economy Committee a few months ago between Fergus Ewing and Rhoda Grant, where we had the rather surreal experience of seeing the SNP minister arguing vehemently why we must keep to the UK standard, and Rhoda Grant from the Labour Party arguing why, no, we needed to have a separate Scottish standard. In this case, I think the minister actually was correct. The difficulty, of course, with a higher standard, as we heard in evidence from people from the industry, is that they simply would not invest in new plant in Scotland if they could build it cheaper south of the border. So we'd still end up using the same power. We would just be importing it from down south, and the jobs would be there instead of in Scotland, and we would get no economic benefit. So the minister was right in that particular regard, although it might seem counterintuitive. Deputy Presiding Officer, there are three principles that should underlie a modern energy policy: affordability, security of supply, and decarbonisation. And of course, there's always a difficulty in achieving a balance between those three principles. And there undoubtedly is a conflict, we're seeing it at the moment, between affordability and decarbonisation, because decarbonised forms of energy are more expensive. CCS has the opportunity to bridge that gap if it can be done economically. Joan McAlpin mentioned in China building one new power station, coal-burning power station per week. Germany this year is opening 3 new coal-burning stations as a result of the decision by their government, which I think is deeply mistaken, to stop relying on nuclear power and moving instead to a high-carbon technology such as coal. If we're going to burn more coal, we need to deal with the carbon. That's why CCS commercialisation is so important. That's why the stance being taken by the UK government, complementary and supported to that being taken by the Scottish Government, has been so warmly welcomed. And that's why I'm pleased to finish my remarks by saying how positive this debate has been and how it's good to see us all, pretty much all, on the same page.
Thank you very much. And I now call in Ian Gray, 8 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it has been an interesting debate, quite wide-ranging. I think it's ranged from the depleted reservoirs and saline aquifers of the North Sea all the way to the algal feedstock plants in Australia, via China, Germany and Poland and one or two other places, I think, in between. And that's been an interesting aspect of the debate because I think it does reflect the global importance of this technology and the issues that we've been discussing around what needs to be done in order to turn this technology into something which is commercially available and viable are certainly not concerns that we're the only ones debating. It's something which is being considered right across the world. But many of the speakers, I think correctly, have reflected on Scotland's particular potential for developing carbon capture and storage technology with the depleted reservoirs that we have, the pipelines already in place, and so on. Others have also referred to the connected potential that Scotland has for using fossil fuels because of the reserves we have of coal and potentially gas as well. So it is a global issue we've been discussing, but I think rightly a lot of the debate is focused on Scotland's particular place in that. Others have used the opportunity to give us a lesson in chemistry, and Mr Don's lesson was quite certainly chemistry, not physics. Ms McAlpine gave us a short lesson in the history of chemistry as well, which I think was of some interest too. A number of speakers, perhaps particularly Lewis MacDonald and Kenny Gibson, went into some detail around the proposal in Peterhead, and quite rightly too, because that is an extremely important one. And one of the key points that they both referred to was that a success at Peterhead would mean the first example of carbon capture retrofitted to a gas-fired power station. And that is important for Scotland. I have a constituency interest in this because I have a power station at Cockenzie, which closed earlier this year, with consent already existing for that to be replaced by a combined cycle gas power station. Unlike Hunterston, there is widespread local support for that project to go forward. This is a community which has produced electricity and power for Scotland at Cockenzie for over 40 years. And those who've been involved in that, some of them for the whole 40 years, we'd very much like to see their sons and daughters involved in doing that again at Cockenzie into the future. But if they are to do so without damaging the environment, not only do we need the investment in the new plant, but we also need carbon capture technology which is applicable to that kind of power generation. So I have an interest in seeing Peterhead demonstrate that that's possible. There's been some discussion about whether this is the first debate we've had on CCS or not. Whether it is or not, I think it's a good thing that we had the debate today, because to paraphrase the title of the book and film, we do need to talk about CCS. Firstly, because this is a critical point for the technology. Patrick Harvey has on a number of occasions strongly made the point that this is a technology not yet demonstrated at a viable commercial level. And I think that is really just a statement of fact. And the projects that have been referred to, and there are others closer to home, in Wales, for example, there's a working project at small scale, have been small ones, which demonstrate that bits of the technology do work. If we look at bigger projects, it is a mixed picture. Margaret McDougall referred to the decision in Norway, in Mongstad, to close down that project there. And quite an interesting aside to that, given a recent intervention which took place. The previous Prime Minister of Norway described Mongstad working as being Norway's equivalent of performing a moon landing. But that is a project which Norway has now pulled back from. On the other side, Mr. Stevenson gave us working examples from China, pushing forward with the technology, and there are examples too, for example, from Canada. The Boundary Dam is a significant sized project which is in fact already under construction. So there is a mixed picture of how this technology is moving forward. The truth is that what it needs is the will to push it forward and support it. And that's why the importance of the current competition in the UK and the contract for difference as it refers to the Captain Clean Energy project have featured in the debate. And just in the passing, to say there has been a couple of references to the first Peterhead project, and I think we should be clear about that the first Peterhead project was, of course, a pre-ignition gasification proposal, not a retrofit, but an experimental proposal, and never met the parameters of the competition that existed at that time. What's interesting, though, I think, is that it did bear similarities to the Captain Clean Energy project now, which I think shows how things have moved on in the intervening years. But we need to talk about CCS because this is also a critical point for our targets. And a number of speakers have made reference to our Climate Change Act targets and the 2030 decarbonisation target for the power industry. And it is absolutely true that any examination of the RPP2, which describes how we will move, the government believe we will move to these targets, does show that it is highly dependent on significant and rapid progress on CCS technology. In fact, it requires us to have 500 megawatts in operation by 2020, another 500 in operation by 2025, and assumes over 1.5 gigawatts of gas generation, carbon being captured, being operational by 2027. Those are extremely challenging targets, which in all honesty it is quite difficult to see from where we stand now how we will achieve them. And Mr. Allard talked about we have set the bar high, and I think that is, we've set the bar high on decarbonisation, we've set the bar high on climate change targets, and the government have set the bar high on renewable energy targets. The danger is that we end up in a position where we celebrate the height of the bar but ignore our failure to actually reach it. And that is what I think Mr. Harvey has said we must try and avoid. Mr Mackenzie was quite eloquent when he said we have the skills, we have the academics, we have the infrastructure. I think we have to ask ourselves then perhaps why we're not further ahead. That's a serious conversation that we really need to be prepared to have. I don't think that means we should turn our back on CCS. I think we should redouble our efforts. So I have a lot of sympathy for some of the arguments Mr Harvey has put, but I have to say that I do believe oil and gas is an asset and a resource. It is not an intrinsically bad thing. That is down to how we use it, and therefore we do support the possibility of enhanced recovery of oil using CCS technology, and for that reason we won't be able to support the Green Amendment this evening. And as for the Tory amendment, I understand Mr Fraser's caution about picking one project out, but I do think that given that the Captain project was in the government amendment, it might look a little strange and be misinterpreted to remove it. And I have also expressed, I think quite gently, concerns about the timescale of the current competition, and for those reasons we won't be able to support the Tory amendment tonight either.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Fergus Ewing to wind up the debate. You have until 5 o'clock, Minister.
Presiding Officer, could I begin by pointing out that I omitted to mention earlier that Shell was also represented in the gallery today. Belinda Perriman, who provided an excellent briefing to MSPs earlier today, was here for part of the debate, and we greatly appreciate the support that she and her colleagues, our team of 56, I believe, at Shell are providing. And I should also have made it clear that, of course, Shell are being supported by SSE in connection with this project, something that I think should be placed in the record, as I'm not sure that it was earlier on, which may well have been my fault, Presiding Officer. This has been an interesting, informed and at times an impassioned debate. It's been one of the most constructive debates that I can remember taking place here in this Parliament, as Mr Fraser alluded to, or put it in a slightly different way. And that's very welcome. I can't remember actually before having led a debate in which Mr Harvey expressed the view that it was a balanced debate. So I think we should accept that that's some form of progress, although I was surprised when Frankenstein made a somewhat unexpected appearance and entry into this debate. It's not Frankenstein, but Mr Harvey.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Just to reinforce, the creature, in my view, has been much maligned over the years. I hope I wouldn't be accused of calling either it or CCS a monster, but it was no doubt not a healthy creature.
Minister.
Well, even Frankenstein can be rehabilitated, Presiding Officer. Very welcome. I thought that the contributions really across the chamber were extremely useful. I know Angus MacDonald has been assiduous as the local MSP in pursuing this issue and acquainting himself about the facts, in meeting the company that wishes to invest a huge amount of money in his constituency, and I welcome that, and I welcome his continuing strong interest in this matter. I think Jo McAlpin, in her speech, rightly put her finger on the importance of the academic side in all of this. And it's not just pure research. It's important because people like Professor Hazeldine, who is in the gallery here, and many others, are working with the companies in a very direct way and assisting them present very complex information to potential investors, for example, I understand, as a matter of general practice. That's an extremely useful combination of academia and industry working together, particularly in technologies which have not yet proved themselves in economic terms, as has been pointed out. And I was pleased that Mr Harvey emphasised, if I am correctly quoting him, that he has concerns, not objections. I think that's something that we should welcome in the spirit in which he made his contributions today. I wanted really just to turn and try to address some of the main points of the debate, which I think is what I should be doing. And first of all, the issue of to what extent CCS is an untried technology or an unviable technology, or one which has not yet been proven or been proven to be economically viable. And I think it's always useful just to set out a few facts in order in order that we can then go on from these to make conclusions. Capture by separation of CO2 gas has been undertaken since 1929, and this process, I'm informed by Professor Hazeldine, is widely used worldwide and of course will be used by Shell at the Peterhead power plant. The Summit Power project at Grangemouth will use heating to gasify the coal, not burn it, to capture CO2 and then burn hydrogen. And the overall efficiency of the plant, and I think this was mentioned by one of the Labour speakers, I think Margaret McDougall, is expected to be in the high 30s and low 40s%, even with capture operating. And by contrast, Longanet, with no capture, has an efficiency of around 32%. The gasification process itself, as I'm informed, very well established and used globally in refineries and chemical plants. In other words, the essential pre-combustion element of the process is not a nascent technology, it is an established technology. Indeed, when both Summit Power and Shell were presenting this morning to MSPs, I think they both were anxious to put across the message that we are not dealing with new untried technologies here, we're dealing with settled technologies. And I think to do them justice, and to do them justice in the sense of being fair in relation to the investment of their time on us in seeking to educate us as non-experts, I do wish to stress that they have put across the argument that we're dealing with a series of tested, settled technologies. These are not to be compared, for example, with tidal and wave energy, which, of course, Mr Harvey and myself would support absolutely. It's playing an increasing and very important part in providing electricity for Scotland and indeed the world. They are nascent technologies. This is not a nascent technology that we're dealing with here, and I think it's very important to get that on the record, because at times I felt we were veering off, moving backwards slightly, and I'm not making any individual criticism here to suggest that somehow CCS is at an earlier stage than in fact it is. And of course, transportation of CO2, well, I think I'm going to move on, because I think transportation, with respect to Mr Harvey, I'll perhaps take him later, but it was a point, I think Margaret McDougall again, or perhaps Claudia Beamish may, I think Claudia Beamish, that we need to be absolutely sure that the transportation of the CO2 using the pipelines and into the depleted basins will be correct. I think she's absolutely right, but then again, transportation and storage are technologies which have been deployed all over the world with success, with efficacy, and therefore the point I'm making again is we're not leaping into the dark here, we're not travelling to the moon, we're doing things that have been done for a long time and have been done for a long time all over the world. So I did want to make that point. Moving on, I did want to... Yes, well, okay.
Whether that is in relation to what we're talking about now, or in relation to oil pipelines, because what my concern was, the same concern as RSPB, about the possibilities of leakage of CO2 into the marine environment.
Minister.
Well, my understanding as a non-scientist is that both projects are absolutely confident that we have the existing pipeline structure, that with appropriate analysis and checks can be safely used, and that the storage is a process which has been shown to work, that leakage is not an issue that they cannot deal with, and that these are, and this is the point, fairly settled technologies, not new ones. I wanted just to move on to deal with the 2 points that Mr Fraser raised. Firstly, two or more. I think the fundamental point we want to make, I think, about this is we cannot really expect just to have 2 demonstration projects and that's it. I think we must all recognise that if we are to see the benefits flow from CCS, then there must be more than 2. This motion does not actually prescribe that the third must be Summit Power if one reaches it. It says that such as Captain Clean Energy Project. So it doesn't commit the Conservatives and the Liberals, if they vote for the motion today, which I hope they do, to unconditional support. It says that we want to travel in that direction, and we want to travel in that direction in a practical manner. And I understand it is argued that within the levy control framework there may be the possibility of funding more than the 2 on the preferred bidder as a result of the competition. So we're not asking for the competition to be widened. This would slow things down. It is possible that the reserve bidders, of which Summit is one, may move forward where one of the 2, the White Rose and Shell, to drop off, were that to happen, which we hope that will not, because we want to see England succeed with this technology as well. But I think in that spirit, I hope that we can persuade the Conservatives that we are working together on this, and we can unite later on in Parliament to combine towards that end. Presiding officer, plainly, as I move towards conclusion, this has been a debate that will disappoint some. It will disappoint those who relish confrontation. It will disappoint those who savour the gratuitous trading of casual insults. It will disappoint those who seek from their politicians a sort of peacetime warfare, a warfare of words, a barracking battle, or those who want harangue, hubris and hot air. So I won't give you that. Not today, anyway. I think I just beat Mr. Fraser to that, actually. No, what we do want to give Scotland today is a very broad support for this technology of carbon capture and storage, which has moved beyond, way beyond the talking stage, to where we now have the Shell Peterhead, Shell SSE project, hopefully to go ahead, and a real possibility of a second project at Grangemouth, the Captain Clean Energy Summit Power project, which I think offers Scotland tremendous opportunities. We have world-leading decarb targets, we have a large and mature hydrocarbon sector, we have a strong engineering sector, we have the pipeline infrastructure, we have extensive opportunities for geological CO2 storage, and we have academic excellence. I don't think there's any other countries in the world that have all 6 of these extraordinary assets. Scotland is quite simply the best place in the world for carbon capture and storage.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on carbon capture and storage. We now move to decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 7974.2 in the name of Murdo Fraser, which seeks to amend motion number 7974 in the name of Fergus Ewing on carbon capture and storage be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The amendment is not agreed to. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7974.2 in the name of Murdo Fraser is as follows: yes 12, no 68. There were 2 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 7974.1 in the name of Patrick Harvey, which seeks to amend motion number 7974 in the name of Fergus Ewing on carbon capture and storage be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7974.1 in the name of Patrick Harvey is as follows: yes 3, no 79. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7974 in the name of Fergus Ewing on carbon capture and storage be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 7974 in the name of Fergus Ewing is as follows. Yes, 67. No, 3. There were 12 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. I now close this meeting.